On a February morning in 1934, a gunshot echoed through the marble halls of the big house. The servants found August Anheuser Busch Sr. slumped in his bedroom, a revolver still warm beside him. On his desk lay a note, hastily scrawled in the trembling hand of a dying man. "Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children." Outside the frost-covered windows, the deer park stretched silent beneath a gray winter sky, and somewhere in the distance, the famous Clydesdales stamped nervously in their stables, sensing that something terrible had happened to the master of Grant's farm. But the story of this place, this sprawling estate where American presidents once walked and beer barons built their dreams in brick and limestone, does not begin with death. It begins with love. It begins with a young Army lieutenant riding his horse down a dusty Missouri road in 1843, his heart full of anticipation, his mind racing with thoughts of a woman he had not yet met. The property that would one day become Grant's farm has witnessed nearly 2 centuries of American ambition, heartbreak, and reinvention. Within its boundaries, a future president proposed marriage on a wraparound porch. An immigrant's grandson built a French chateau that would have made Louis XIV jealous. Children grew up riding elephants as pets and watching zebras graze outside their bedroom windows. And through it all, tragedy stalked the grounds like a shadow, claiming lives in ways that seemed almost cruelly ironic for a family whose fortune flowed from the frothy head of America's favorite beer. To understand Grant's farm, you must first understand the land itself. 10 miles southwest of St. Louis, where Gravois Creek cuts through rolling Missouri countryside, Colonel Frederick Dent built his plantation home sometime between 1812 and 1816. He called it White Haven, after an ancestral estate in Maryland, and he filled it with the trappings of Southern gentility. Enslaved workers tended the fields, their labor transforming the wild Missouri soil into productive farmland. His children rode horses through the oak groves, their laughter echoing across acres that would one day witness very different sounds. And his favorite daughter, Julia, grew up believing that life would always be this golden, this simple, this predictable. The Missouri countryside in those years possessed a beauty that photographs cannot capture. Rolling hills carpeted in native bluestem grass gave way to dense stands of oak and hickory that flamed orange and red each autumn. Creeks carved gentle valleys where deer came to drink in the evening light. The air smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers and the particular sweetness of fertile soil turning under the plow. It was country that seemed to promise abundance to anyone willing to work for it. A promise that would prove both true and false in the decades to come. She was wrong, of course. Life rarely cooperates with our expectations. In 1843, a young man arrived at nearby Jefferson Barracks, fresh from graduation at West Point. His name was Ulysses Simpson Grant, though his friends knew him as Sam, and he had been roommates at the academy with Julia's brother Frederick. When Fred invited his former roommate to visit White Haven, neither man could have predicted the consequences. Grant rode up the long drive, probably nervous, certainly curious about the family his friend had described in such glowing terms. And then he saw her. Julia Dent was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She was short and somewhat stocky, with a condition that caused one of her eyes to drift. But she possessed a warmth and spirit that captivated the young lieutenant immediately. They shared a love of horses and novels. They were both raised as strict Methodists, and within 4 months of that first meeting, Ulysses Grant was hopelessly, completely in love. Picture the scene. It is spring in 1844. The dogwoods are blooming white and pink along the creek banks. Grant and Julia sit together on the front porch of Whitehaven, the evening light fading to amber and rose. He reaches for her hand. She does not pull away. And there, on that porch overlooking the rolling Missouri hills, he asks her to be his wife. She says yes. But there is a complication. Colonel Dent had dreams for his favorite daughter, dreams that did not include a penniless army officer from Ohio. The engagement remained secret for a full year before Grant gathered enough courage to formally ask for Julia's hand. The colonel reluctantly agreed, but fate intervened before they could marry. War was brewing on the Mexican border, and Lieutenant Grant received orders to deploy south. For 4 years, the lovers would be separated, their connection sustained only by letters that crossed hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. When Grant finally returned in 1848, he was a changed man. He had seen combat, had watched friends die, had proven himself capable of leading men under fire. Julia, too, had changed. She was no longer a girl, but a woman of 22, patient and determined. They married that August in a ceremony at Whitehaven, though Grant's father refused to attend. Jesse Grant was an abolitionist, and he could not condone his son marrying into a slaveholding family. This tension would define much of what followed. After years of military postings that took him as far as the Pacific coast, Grant resigned his commission in 1854 and returned to Missouri with his growing family. Julia's father gave them 80 acres as a wedding gift, and Grant threw himself into the work of farming. He labored alongside the enslaved workers at Whitehaven, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest, trying desperately to build something that was his alone. The house he built during this period still stands today on the grounds of Grant's farm. He called it Hardscrabble, a name that perfectly captured both its crude construction and his feelings about the struggle to create it. Working with logs he felled himself, Grant erected a simple cabin that was, by his own admission, unattractive but solid. Julia hated it. She had grown up in the comfortable rooms of Whitehaven, and this rough-hewn structure with its cold drafts and cramped spaces felt like a step backward. They lived there for less than 3 months before moving back to her parents' home. The Hardscrabble cabin would outlive nearly everyone who knew it. In 1904, it was purchased by a coffee merchant named Cyrus Blank for $8,000 and displayed at the St. Louis World's Fair. Millions of visitors walked past the humble logs that a future president had notched and lifted into place. And when the fair ended, the cabin found a new owner, a man whose family had come to America with nothing but ambition, and who had transformed that ambition into an empire built on hops and barley. Adolphus Busch arrived in St. Louis in 1857, the 21st child of a German wine merchant. He was 18 years old, spoke limited English, and possessed only a small inheritance and unlimited confidence. Within 2 years, he had partnered with Ernst Wattenberg to sell brewing supplies to the dozens of small breweries that served the city's large German immigrant population. It was through this business that he met Eberhard Anheuser, a soap manufacturer who had recently acquired a struggling brewery as payment for a debt. Anheuser's beer was, by all accounts, mediocre, but his daughter Lily was not. Adolphus fell in love with her just as thoroughly as Grant had fallen for Julia Dent 2 decades earlier. On March 7, 1861, in a Lutheran church in St. Louis, Adolphus and Lily were married. His brother Ulrich married Lily's sister Anna in the same ceremony. 2 brothers, 2 sisters, 1 family, 1 destiny. What happened next was nothing short of remarkable. Adolphus threw himself into improving his father-in-law's brewery with the same energy he had applied to everything else in his young life. He understood that the future of American beer lay not in small local operations, but in national distribution. To achieve this, he pioneered techniques that had never been attempted on such a scale. He was among the first to pasteurize beer, allowing it to survive the temperature fluctuations of long-distance transport. He built networks of ice houses along railroad lines. He created America's first fleet of refrigerated freight cars. By 1879, the company had been renamed Anheuser Busch, and Adolphus had become its driving force. He introduced Budweiser in 1876, marketing it as a Bohemian-style Pilsner with universal appeal. The Czechs had long called their beer from Budějovice the beer of kings. Adolphus flipped the phrase and declared Budweiser the king of beers. It was genius marketing, and America drank it up by the millions of barrels. The wealth that followed was staggering. Adolphus built mansions in St. Louis, California, New York, and Germany. He owned his own railroad car for cross-country travel. For his 50th wedding anniversary in 1911, he threw a party for 13,000 people at the St. Louis Coliseum and gave each of his 9 children $1 million to build their own homes. When President William Howard Taft encountered him at a gathering, he reportedly exclaimed, "There's my friend, Prince Bush." It was not an exaggeration. Adolphus Busch lived like royalty, and he intended for his descendants to continue the tradition. In 1903, his son August Anheuser Busch Sr. purchased the old Dent property, including Grant's hardscrabble cabin. The land had changed hands several times since the Civil War, but the connection to the 18th President of the United States remained its most valuable asset. August saw an opportunity to transform the property into something that would honor both American history and his family's growing dynasty. Construction began in 1910 on what the family would come to call the Big House. August hired the architectural firm of Frederick Widman and Robert Walsh, specialists in brewery design, who had proven their ability to translate German grandeur into American materials. The resulting mansion defied easy categorization. Its influences stretched from the hunting lodges of Louis XIII at Versailles to the brick palaces of Prussian aristocracy. 26 rooms spread across 3 stories above a full basement. 14 bathrooms served the family and their frequent guests. A cour d'honneur, or court of honor, created a horseshoe-shaped entrance that could accommodate carriages arriving for formal occasions. But look closer, and you see something else. The elaborate sculptural ornamentation that defines French Renaissance architecture is notably absent. The facade is restrained, almost masculine in its simplicity. German pride in honest brickwork shows in the exterior walls, where even the balustrades reject traditional stone in favor of fired clay. Adolphus Busch may have lived like French royalty, but his descendants built like German burghers, solid and substantial, and meant to last. The cost reached $300,000, a fortune in 1913 when the mansion was completed. Julius Pitzmann, the famous German-American surveyor, designed the grounds alongside landscape architect George Kessler. They created a deer park that recalled the hunting preserves of European nobility, stocking it with elk, bison, and exotic cattle. The message was clear. The Busch family had arrived, and they intended to stay. Step inside the Big House today, if you could, and you would find yourself transported to another era entirely. The entrance hall rises 3 stories, flooded with light from tall windows that frame views of the deer park beyond. The grand staircase curves upward in a graceful sweep, its balusters turned from the same Missouri oak that Grant once felled for his cabin. 14 bathrooms served the family and their guests, each tiled in imported marble that had been shipped across the Atlantic and hauled up the long drive by wagon. Crystal chandeliers that would not look out of place in a European palace hang from coffered ceilings, their facets catching sunlight and scattering it across walls painted in the rich colors that were fashionable before the First World War. The private chapel of St. Hubert occupies a quiet corner of the estate, its stained glass windows depicting the patron saint of hunters in homage to the family's sporting passions. Here, generations of Bushes have been baptized and married and mourned. The altar cloth was embroidered by Trudy Busch herself, a reminder that even among such wealth, some traditions required a personal touch. When the light is right, the chapel glows with colors that seem impossibly vivid, blues and reds and golds that transform the small space into something approaching the sacred. But Adolphus never saw his son's masterpiece completed. In 1906, a cold turned to pneumonia, and his health never fully recovered. He grew increasingly weak, his famous energy finally beginning to fail. On October 10th, 1913, Adolphus Busch died at his villa in Germany, his body ravaged by the dropsy that had plagued his final years. He was survived by his wife Lily, 5 daughters, and 2 sons. His estate was valued at $60 million, equivalent to well over $1 billion in today's currency. The funeral that followed was unlike anything St. Louis had ever seen. A procession stretched 20 miles from the brewery to Bellefontaine Cemetery. 100,000 mourners lined the streets. The mayor requested 5 minutes of citywide silence, and the lights at the Jefferson and Planters House hotels went dark. Streetcars stopped in their tracks. 25 truckloads of flowers arrived at the cemetery, so many that florists for miles around completely sold out. Lily, not content with the existing family mausoleum, had it demolished and commissioned a new one in the Bavarian Gothic style. Built of Missouri stone and completed in 1921, it cost $250,000 and features carved grapevines representing both Adolphus's birthplace in German wine country and his favorite beverage. August Sr. assumed leadership of Anheuser-Busch just as storm clouds gathered over the nation. World War I brought intense anti-German sentiment that threatened everything the immigrant family had built. August navigated these dangers with skill, emphasizing the company's American identity while quietly maintaining the German traditions that had made it great. Then came an even greater challenge. On January 17, 1920, prohibition became the law of the land. The manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages was now illegal, and the king of beers found its kingdom suddenly barren. Most breweries simply closed their doors. August refused. He diversified into corn products, baker's yeast, ice cream, and soft drinks. The company manufactured automobile bodies and commercial refrigeration units. They did whatever it took to keep the workers employed and the facilities maintained, waiting for the day when America would come to its senses. It was a long wait, 13 years of uncertainty, of watching competitors fail, of wondering if the family business would survive to see legal beer again. The strain took its toll. By the early 1930s, August's health was failing. Heart disease, dropsy, and gout confined him increasingly to the big house, where doctors administered morphine for the pain. He watched from the sidelines as Congress debated the repeal of prohibition, knowing that he might not live to see the victory. And then, on that February morning in 1934, just months after the 21st Amendment ended the long national drought, August Anheuser-Busch Sr. made his final decision. He had guided the company through the darkest period in its history. He had preserved the family legacy against impossible odds, but he could not preserve himself. The gunshot that echoed through the big house was his answer to the pain that had become unbearable. The coroner's jury gathered in the mansion, and heard testimony from August's chauffeur and his personal physician, who had administered morphine just 7 hours before the suicide. Their verdict was official but unnecessary. Everyone understood. The brewery had survived. Its master had not. Leadership passed to August's elder son, Adolphus Busch III, a capable executive who maintained the company through the remainder of the Depression and the Second World War. But Adolphus III was not destined for a long tenure. In 1946, he died unexpectedly, and the most colorful, controversial, and consequential figure in Busch family history stepped into the spotlight. His name was August Anheuser Busch Jr., but everyone called him Gussie. Born in 1899, the same year the company's output first exceeded 1 million barrels, Gussie had grown up in the shadow of legends. His grandfather had built an empire. His father had saved it. Now it fell to him to make it dominant. And Gussie Busch approached this challenge with a personality that was part carnival barker, part Bavarian baron, and part bare-knuckle brawler. He was, by all accounts, a man of enormous appetites. He loved horses and hunting with a passion that bordered on obsession. He threw parties that became the stuff of St. Louis legend, complete with food fights that sometimes ended with fire extinguishers being pulled from walls and sprayed at guests coming off elevators. He married 4 times and fathered 11 children. He could be generous to the point of extravagance and vindictive to the point of cruelty, sometimes in the same conversation. But Gussie was also a marketing genius who understood that selling beer was really about selling emotion. In April of 1933, just as Prohibition ended, he and his brother Adolphus pulled off one of the greatest promotional stunts in American business history. They told their father that they had bought him a new car and asked him to step outside the brewery to see it. Instead of a Model T, August Sr. found 6 massive Clydesdale horses pulling a red, white, and gold beer wagon loaded with the first legal Budweiser in 13 years. The old man wept with joy, and Gussie immediately understood what he had created. Within hours, a second team of Clydesdales was dispatched to New York, where they delivered a case of Budweiser to former Governor Al Smith, who had fought for years to end Prohibition. The horses paraded down Fifth Avenue to the Empire State Building, while thousands of New Yorkers cheered. From there, they traveled to Washington to present a case to President Franklin Roosevelt. The Budweiser Clydesdales had been born, and they would become one of the most recognized advertising symbols in American history. Today, those horses still graze the pastures of Grant's farm, their descendants bred and trained on the very ground where Ulysses Grant once struggled to make a crop grow. The irony would not be lost on anyone who knew the full story. Grant, the man who failed at farming, eventually became the most successful military commander of his generation. The Bushes, who succeeded beyond imagination in brewing, would fail in ways that Grant never could have imagined. But that failure lay far in the future. In 1952, Gussie married his 3rd wife, a beautiful Swiss woman named Gertrude Buchholzer, known to everyone as Trudy. She was 22 years old, elegant, and refined. Everything that Gussie's more rough-hewn personality was not. At her urging, the big house was reopened as a family residence for the first time in decades. Together, they would have 7 children and create a lifestyle that would have made Adolphus himself envious. The couple was rarely photographed without impeccable attire. Finely tailored riding clothes during the day gave way to formal evening wear by night. They hosted annual gatherings for the staff, complete with champagne toasts and bonus envelopes. They maintained German traditions like the Schlachtfest, connecting the Missouri mansion to the old country customs that Adolphus had brought across the Atlantic nearly a century before. Life magazine featured them in a 1955 spread called the Baronial Busches, and the description fit perfectly. They were American aristocrats living on an American estate, presiding over an American kingdom. In 1953, Gussie added another jewel to the family crown. The St. Louis Cardinals baseball team was in trouble. Its owner, Fred Seig, had been convicted of tax evasion and faced banishment from the sport. Worse, rumors swirled that he would sell the team to investors who planned to move it to Houston or Milwaukee. Gussie could not allow St. Louis to lose its beloved Cardinals. He persuaded the Anheuser-Busch board to buy the team for $3.75 million, keeping it in the city where it belonged. For the next 36 years, Gussie Busch and the Cardinals were inseparable. He built them a new stadium. He signed them to contracts that made them baseball's first million-dollar payroll. He rode his Clydesdale-drawn wagon around the warning track before home games, waving to fans who adored him. Under his ownership, the Cardinals won 6 National League pennants and 3 World Series championships. When he died, the team retired the number 85 in his honor, his age at the time of the tribute. In 1954, Gussie made another decision that would shape the estate's future. With the support of Anheuser-Busch, he opened Grant's Farm to the public for the first time. Visitors could ride trams through the deer park, marvel at the exotic animals, and receive complimentary samples of Budweiser in the Bauernhof courtyard. It was brilliant marketing disguised as generosity, a way to make ordinary Americans feel connected to the Busch family mystique, while subtly reinforcing brand loyalty. The formula worked spectacularly. Families drove from across the Midwest to experience Grant's Farm, their children pressing faces against tram windows as Buffalo thundered past, their parents savoring cold beer in the shade of century-old oaks. The Busch family had created something unique, a private estate that welcomed the public, an aristocratic preserve that celebrated democratic values. It was, in many ways, the perfect American contradiction. The animals multiplied over the years. Elephants joined the collection, massive creatures that the Busch children treated as oversized pets. Zebras grazed alongside domestic cattle, camels and emus and macaws added exotic color to the Missouri landscape. Young Billy Busch would later recall riding horses through herds of bison and elk in the deer park, an experience that seemed impossibly magical even to a child raised in such extraordinary circumstances. But for all the glory, darkness never stayed far from Grant's Farm. In 1974, tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. Gussie's youngest child, 8-year-old Christina, was being driven home from school when the car was involved in an 8-vehicle accident. Christina and the family chauffeur were killed. Her brother Andrew survived but would carry the trauma forever. Gussie was 75 years old when he lost his little girl. Friends said he was never the same afterward. The boisterous, larger-than-life personality that had dominated boardrooms and ballparks seemed to dim, replaced by something fragile and wounded. He became increasingly difficult to work with, his grief expressing itself as rage at those around him. What happened next would shape the Busch family for generations to come.